Anstruther in Fifeshire, where they surrendered to the Baileys. Lopez de Medina was among this handful of survivors. Melville, the Presbyterian minister of Anstruther, describes him as a very reverent man of big stature and grave and stout countenance, grey-haired and very humble-like, as he asked for quarter for himself and his comrades in misfortune. Other distressed ships fled from the Atlantic storms for shelter inside the Hebrides. The three entered the Sound of Mull, where one was wrecked near Lochaline and the second off Ceylon. The third, the great galleass Florencia, went down in Tobermory Bay. The local fishermen still tell the traditional story of her arrival and shipwreck. She lies in deep water, half buried in the sand of the bottom, and enterprising divers are now busy with modern scientific appliances, trying to recover the pieces of 8 in her war chest and the silver plate which, according to a dispatch of Walsingham's, was the dinner service for the grandee of Spain who commanded her. But it was on the shores of the island of Ireland that the most tragic disasters of the Armada took place. Its wrecks strewed the north and west coasts. Fitzwilliam, the deputy or the viceroy in Dublin, and Bingham, the governor of Connaught, had taken precautions to prevent the Spaniards finding shelter, water, and food in the ports by reinforcing the western garrison. Bingham feared that the Irish might be friendly to the Spaniards, and industriously spread among the coast population tales that if they landed, the foreigners would massacre the old and carry the young away into slavery. The people of the ports, who had long traded with Spain, knew better, but some of the rude fisher folk of the west coast perhaps believed the slander. Where shipwrecked crews fell into the hands of Bingham's men, no mercy was shown them. He marched 400 prisoners into Galway, and his troops massacred them in cold blood, and then he reported that, having made a clean dispatch of them both within the town and in the country abroad, he rested Sunday all day, giving praise and thanks to God for Her Majesty's most happy success in that action, and our deliverance from such dangerous enemies. One of the Urcas came into Tralee Bay in an almost sinking condition, with her crew reduced to 23 men, ill and half-starved and unable to work the ship. Sir Edward Denny, the governor of Tralee Castle, was absent. The Spaniards surrendered to Lady Denny and her garrison. The men begged for their lives, and some said they had friends in Waterford who would pay ransom for them, but the lady had them all put to the sword, because there was no safe keeping for them. In all, some 25 galleons were dashed to pieces under the giant cliff walls of the Irish coast, or on outlying skerries and rocky headlands. In a few cases the Irish coast people helped the survivors, but too often they were as cruel as the English, and killed and plundered them. Sir George Carew wrote to the Queen, rejoicing that there was now blood between the Irish and the King of Spain. The government troops marched along the coasts hunting for Spaniards. The Lord Deputy Fitzwilliam accompanied one of these parties, and told how in Sligo Bay he saw miles of wreckage, timber enough to build 5 of the greatest ships that I ever saw, besides mighty great boats, cables, and other cordage, and some such masts for bigness and length as I never saw any two could make the like. Fitzwilliam fairly revelled in the destruction of the Spaniards. He wrote to Secretary Walsingham, "Since it hath pleased God by his hand upon the rocks to drown the greater and better part of them, I will, with his favour, be his soldier for dispatching of those rags which yet remain." At last he got tired of this miserable kind of soldiering, and proclaimed mercy for all Spaniards in Ireland who surrendered before 15 January, 1589. Numbers of ragged and starving men surrendered. Others had already been smuggled over to Scotland, still an independent country, where they were well treated and given transport to Spain. the gallant Alonso de Leyva, after escaping from the wreck of his good ship the Rata Coronado in Blacksod Bay, was steering from Scotland in one of the galleasses that had rescued him and his comrades, when the ship was driven by a storm against the wild cliffs of Dunluce Castle near the Giant's Causeway. The galleass was shattered to matchwood, and Leyva perished with all on board save 5 who swam ashore. In the last days of September the surviving ships of the Armada came straggling into the northern ports of Spain with starving, fever-stricken crews. Medina Sidonia had kept some 50 sail together till 18 September. He had resigned all active duties of command to his lieutenants Flores and Fabadilla, for he was ill and broken in spirit. His hair had whitened and he looked like an old man, as he sat all day in the great cabin of the San Martin with his head in his hands. A Biscay gale scattered the remnants of the Armada, and on 21 September the San Martin appeared alone off Santander. The wind had fallen, her sails hung loose from the yards, and the long swell that followed the gale was driving the ship towards the rocks outside the port. Some boats went out and towed her in. Most of the crew was sick. Nearly 200 had been buried at sea. Recalde and Oquendo brought their ships home, but landed broken with the hardships of the terrible voyage, and only survived it a few weeks. Every ship that arrived told of many buried at sea, and landed scores of dying and fever and scurvy-stricken men, so that all the northern ports were like great hospitals. When the last galleon had struggled into harbor, 55 great ships were still missing. The best of the leaders were dead. Not more than a third of the sailors and soldiers survived. It was a disaster from which Spain as a naval power never really recovered. For 50 years to come, the Spanish infantry still upheld their claim to be invincible on the battlefield, but the tall galleon had ceased to be the mistress of the seas. The campaign of the Armada is remarkable not only for inaugurating the modern period of naval war, the era of the sail and the gun, but also because, though it ended in disaster for one side and success for the other, there were from the first to last in a long series of engagements in the narrow seas no battle fought to a finish. In all the fighting, the English showed that they had grasped the essential idea of the new warfare, and proved themselves better sailors and better gunners, but the number of the ships they took or destroyed was insignificant. Howard was so crippled by the parsimonious mismanagement on the part of his government that he had to be content with half-doings instead of decisive results. But there was worse mismanagement on the Spanish side, and this led first to failure, then to disaster. The story of the Armada is full of useful lessons, but for England its message for all time is that her true defense against invasion lies not in armies but upon the sea. The Elizabethan captains knew well that if once Parma's veterans landed in Kent or Essex, the half-trained levies gathered by the beacon fires could do little to stop their onward march. So they took care to make the narrow seas an impassable barrier to the enemy by harassing the covering fleet and making it hopeless for Parma even to think of sending his transports to sea. The lesson is worth remembering even now. End of chapter 6.